is my shepherd, I won't be wanting, I won't be wanting. He makes me rest in fields of green with quiet streams. Even though I walk through the valley of death and dying, I will not fear, 'cause you are with me, you're always with me. Your shepherd's staff comforts me, you are my feast in the presence of enemies, and surely goodness will follow me, follow me, in the house of God forever. God is my shepherd, I won't be wanting, I won't be wanting. He makes me rest in fields of green by quiet streams. Even though I walk through the valley of death and dying, I will not fear, 'cause you are with me, you are with me. Your shepherd's staff comforts me, you are my feast in the presence of enemies, and surely goodness will follow me, follow me, in the house of God forever. In the house of God forever. In the house of God forever. In the house of God forever.
We've been going through the lectionary's assigned psalms for Lent. I've mentioned a couple times that we preachers don't often preach from the psalms. But when we do, there are some psalms that are lesser known, and it's nice. It's kind of nice to bring them to everybody's attention. And then there's Psalm 23. A psalm so well known and so beloved that it's almost dangerous to preach on it. Sometimes it means so much to a person that a certain idea or a certain way of reading it is essential to them. And if you say anything about it, you might mess that up for them. Or then the other side of it is, it's so well known that what can you really say about it that people haven't already heard hundreds of times? We get it, Pastor. Okay, God is a shepherd. we're sheep, right? God takes care of us. That's very nice. Check the box. Great. Let's all log off and get back to our Sunday early this week. But the fact is, there can be a danger with over familiarity. When I had only been a college student for just 1 month, all right, at Point Loma Nazarene University where I went to school, I'd only been there 1 month, and the university posted signs around the campus looking for students who would go on a little tour and talk about the university at different Nazarene churches. And so I volunteered and worked it out so that basically Point Loma paid for me to go back to my hometown and tell them about Point Loma. So Point Loma loaded a bunch of us into a van, about 10 of us, and we started driving north from San Diego, and we dropped off students here and there all along the way going north. And as far north as Napa is, where I'm from, the Napa Valley, by the time it was time to drop me off, there were only 3 of us left in the car. And I don't know where the other 2 guys were going, but somewhere north. I do know that they didn't live up there. These 2 guys were from Orange County. But as we were getting closer to the beautiful Napa Valley, the number of hills were increasing with oak trees all around. And back then it used to rain in the fall, so the hills were green and beautiful. And the other guys, they started commenting on just how beautiful the hills were. And honestly, I didn't see it. I didn't understand what they were talking about. I'd seen those hills so many times in my life that I didn't even recognize anymore how amazing they were. And I was literally confused at what they were saying, confused enough with their fascination over these totally average hills that it stuck in my mind just how much in love with them they were. Well, years later, when I'd finally lived far enough away for a long enough time that I could go back into Napa and see what it was that struck them as well. And that's the risk that we run with this familiarity that we have with Psalm 23. And so this morning, I'd like to point out some aspects of the passage that we may be overlooking sometimes, but that may give us an opportunity to see it with fresh eyes and from a new perspective. So let's read it. Psalm 23, verses 1 through 6. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Well, the Psalms are songs, and we don't know the melodies to these, and we, not knowing Hebrew, we only have the poetry in our English translation. But Hebrew poetry, it usually follows some really very rigid and specific forms. Now, there were different kinds of forms that a poet could make use of, but most of them, whatever form they're using, they really follow the rules pretty closely. On the other hand, Psalm 23 doesn't. And a lot of people believe that that is what was so beautiful. That's what makes it so special to us. It's like David he adamantly wanted to express these certain ideas, these images that he had about God, so much so that he started in this format and then just tossed it aside and wrote out of pure passion. Well, some of the rule breaking we can't see in English, but then some of it is kind of recognizable. I mean, in the first 3 verses, he formally speaks about God as a shepherd in the third person. He makes me lie down. He refreshes. He guides. But then in verse 4, he keeps talking about God as a shepherd, but switches to the first person. You are with me. Your rod and staff comfort me. And then in verse 5 and 6, he keeps the first person, but switches the metaphor completely and begins to speak of God as a banquet host. Now, we actually often sort of forget about this second metaphor that's there of God as a banquet host. The first one of God as a shepherd is so lovely and it stands out so boldly. I mean, the poem starts with the words, "The Lord is my shepherd," and oftentimes, even in our Bibles, the title is there. But so much so that it's not surprising to us that the other image of God as the host kind of falls to the background or even gets forgotten. But let's consider both of these metaphors a little more deeply this morning. First, the shepherd. Most of us today have little concept for the job of a shepherd in Israel 1,000 years before Christ. All we have to go on is images like these ones. And now, if you happen to have this painting or some of these like it hanging in your bedroom, I don't mean to spoil that for you. That's perfectly fine. But they may not be altogether accurate. Here are some images of modern day shepherds in Israel. And these might actually be more accurate. Take note especially of the terrain. Or perhaps what comes to your mind is the idea that David himself had been a shepherd as a boy. So perhaps you're envisioning something like this. Well, whatever the case, we tend to think of this shepherd figure as sort of a fair-skinned, and I hate to say it, but kind of a weakling, right? This fair-skinned wimp lying around in an idyllic, beautiful garden, tenderly caressing or hugging the sheep. And that's probably far from what the job was actually like. For starters, the poem says, "He makes me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters." So first off, consider how difficult it would have been in desert land to find green pastures and still waters. Well, that's one thing. But then it says, "He makes me lie down." And that's not something that sheep do very readily. They are extremely flighty animals. There's this interesting guy named Philip Keller. He grew up as a missionary's kid in Eastern Africa, where he ran around the village and the countryside with the other African kids. And then as a young man, he went to his homeland, Canada, and got a degree in agronomy, which is basically farming, all right? So he became an expert on both crop and livestock management. And then as an adult, he actually spent most of his time writing books about this stuff, but was also a devoted Christian and a biblical scholar. And he wrote about 50 books before he passed away. But one of them was called "A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23." And in it, he talks about how difficult it is to get even just one sheep to lie down, much less a whole flock. I mean, I have enough trouble just trying to get 2 children to lie down at night, never mind sheep. But Keller says, for a lamb to lie down, 4 conditions have to be met: the absence of fear, friction, flies, and famine. So because they are very vulnerable animals, they're herbivores, and they don't have claws or fangs to defend themselves, they have to feel really safe. But sheep are also very social animals. So if there's what he calls friction in the flock, then they won't rest. So eliminate fear, eliminate friction. And then there's things like flies and parasites and nagging nuisances. Those have to be done away with. And then last, if they're hungry, they won't lay down. So flies, famine. Anyways, if you even get the sheep to finally lay down, there has been a whole lot of work that has gone into it to even get that far. Then it says, He guides me along right paths. And even though I walk through the dark valley, I won't fear. So if the shepherd is guiding them along right paths, how is it that they end up in a dark valley? Have you ever wondered that? Those phrases are connected right there in the way the Hebrew goes in the poetry. The dark valley is where the right path led them. So what's up with that? Usually when we think of dark valleys, we have something in mind that's like the valley of dry bones from Ezekiel, or if you're familiar with the movie The Lion King, the elephant graveyard, right? This scary place of danger. But it actually makes sense that the green pastures the poet talks about, they are there in the dark valleys. That's where the shade is. It's where the rivers have carved out the valleys. It's where the water flows. It's where the green grass is near the banks of the rivers down in the shaded, darker valleys. And so if this is such a nice place, well then why all the fear? Because that's also the place where predators would wait, knowing that these vulnerable animals would need to go there to get water at some point. And so they could hide in the darker corners, ready to pounce when the sheep were not suspecting. But if the shepherd is there, his rod and his staff are comfort. They're the comfort the lamb needs to be able to go ahead and lie down and have a real rest in the shade beside the quiet waters. Which brings us to the biggest shift in thinking for us. So that means if a predator attacks the sheep, the shepherd is the one who goes to battle. So much for the meek and mild weakling shepherd guy, right? When David, as a shepherd boy, went out to see his brothers in battle, remember when they were fighting the Philistines and Goliath was taunting the Israelite army, and David volunteered to King Saul. He said, I'll go and fight him. And King Saul, of course, says, why in the world would we send you out there to fight him? And David gives him an amazing answer that will help us understand the real vocation of these shepherds way back then. He says to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or bear comes and carries off a sheep from the flock, I go after it. I attack it and rescue the sheep from its mouth. If it turns on me, I seize it by its hair and club it until I have killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. Now that's what a shepherd does. So when we read this passage, we should envision a very capable, strong defender who is constantly vigilant and ready to make use of his rod on behalf of the weak and vulnerable. And while he's not fending off predators, he's leading us on right paths to the shaded valley where there is pasture and water for our nourishment and rest. Then that imagery of the shepherd, vigilant and ensuring that the sheep can take pasture and lie down near the quiet waters, even with predators, no doubt, hiding all around, waiting for a moment to strike, that imagery is what gives rise to the next metaphor that David employs, the idea of God as a host, and not just any old host, right? He's hosting a banquet in the middle of the enemies. So verse 5 starts out like this. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You know, this is no doubt something King David had actually experienced. Being out on the battlefield, but having a king's quarters set up where he could invite honored guests from his army in to thank them for their bravery or to celebrate their heroism or to encourage them in the battle. He had no doubt done this with his own soldiers out on the battlefield. And in order to do that, with enemies in the camp just across the battlefield, the king needs a guarded space to have one of his men in to be able to bless them and anoint them for the continued battle ahead. And when a soldier in the king's army does this, but comes to the king's quarters and experiences this kind of a feast and celebration in honor of him, that man knows that when all is said and done, when they return back to their kingdom, they will enjoy the goodness and the love of the king for the rest of their lives. So the picture here is the portrait of a God who is king and who invites his faithful into the safe shelter to honor and bless them, even as chaos and even as it's a wild battlefield around them. He invites them in to honor and bless them and to tell them that they are now like family, and he will be faithful to them all of their days, even in the midst of all the stuff going on. And we knew we liked this imagery of a bountiful table and God's goodness and love being with us. But little did we know that in this picture, we are the honored guests. Not just people who slipped in and we're just considering ourselves lucky enough to have been offered a seat at the table, right? No, like that's not the imagery here. What this is showing is that this king, this God has chosen us to be the recipients of honor and blessing. And then to realize that this isn't just going to be a one-time deal. You know, coming in and having a big meal and an overflowing cup for one awesome night of feasting before we get back out to the battle, that's not the idea here. No, it doesn't just stop there. That goodness and love will follow us. We're invited into the feasting room of the house of the Lord, not just here on the battlefield, but forever. Jesus, our King, the Son of David, borrows this theme of the shepherd from his great grandfather, King David, a couple times in his own preaching. In John 10, Jesus says that he's like the gate that the sheep come in and out of at the pen. It's through the gate that the sheep come in and they go out. They come into the pen where they are sheltered and where they're safe for the night. But by day, it's through the gate that they go out and they find pasture and they can roam and they're free and they're led on the right paths out to water and nourishment. And then when the night comes, of course, it's through the gate that they are welcomed back in to safety. And Jesus says, I'm that gate. It's through me that we come to shelter and safety, or it's through him that we go out and yet are still protected while we are out and about in our daily lives. And then he says, I'm also the good shepherd. And you know, a good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He goes that far to be our shelter. And he's not naive to the fact that there are predators out there. In fact, in John 10, he talks about both wolves and thieves. The thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. And then he says, but I have come that you might have life and have it to the full. And to that end, that we might have life, he lays down his for us. He also tells us that when one goes missing, he as the good shepherd goes in search of it. His relentless motivation is to get his sheep safely into the fold where they can listen to his voice and where he can lead them in and out and where they can know life to the fullest, where they can be the objects of his affection, where we can be treated unmerited like honored guests in the shelter of his goodness and love. And it's because we are all like sheep and have wandered away, as Isaiah tells us, that we have the season of Lent. It's a season where we remember that the relentless shepherd God is always in pursuit of us in whatever way we have wandered. And we remember that he is good and that we are invited and called back and beckoned to return to his goodness and love and to live there and to know that it will be with us all of our days. And now may the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, may he equip you with everything good for doing his will, and may he work in us what is pleasing to him, through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen.